Hey Golf Country fans! Today's video is all about the frame and control arms. Let's start with the frame mounting brackets. Off camera I stripped and repainted both brackets. I then cleaned the threads in the bolt holes using an M12 by 1.5 tap. This first hole put up a fight, and here you can see why. I even went back over that hole again. Then I coated the bolt threads with anti-seize lubricant before screwing them back in. With the mounting brackets in place, we can now turn our attention to the frame. As you might have seen in my intro video, this is how my frame looked when I removed it last summer. My neighbor sandblasted and epoxy primered the frame, control arms, and a bunch of other parts. After fixing some overlooked rust spots, I sprayed the frame and suspension parts with Chassis Saver paint. Because Chassis Saver turns gray with UV exposure, I finished all the parts with an inexpensive top coat. Before bolting the frame back on the car, I chased the threads in all of the M12 mounting holes. I'm not showing it here, but I always clean and lubricate the tap before each hole. With the mounting holes all prepped, we're ready to reinstall the frame. Let's talk about bolts now. There are 8 large bolts and 8 large washers required to attach the frame to the car. The longest bolts, shown here in green, each have to pass through both the frame and a control arm bushing, so we can't start with them. Instead, I started with the smaller M10 bolts. These 2 bolts will temporarily fasten the rear end of the frame until I can install the control arms. Meanwhile, I added a ratchet strap up front as a temporary support so that I could install more bolts. The 4 front bolts pass through both the frame and the engine subframe, so they have to be installed together. This is my old rusted out subframe. And here's my shiny new one. I thought it might be smart to mount the steering rack to the subframe first. Ultimately, this didn't save me any effort. Soon I'll make a separate video on just this power steering system. Now I can install the washers and the frontmost bolt on each side. I left the ratchet strap a little loose so that I had wiggle room for the washers. As noted earlier, the biggest mounting bolts also pass through control arm bushings. Here's the front bolt shown in relation to the front control arm. And this is one of my new control arms. The old ones had exceeded their useful life, to put it mildly. There's one last piece before the big bolt goes in. This metal sleeve slides into the bushing hole first. Now we can screw in the big 192mm bolt, with a dab of anti-seize lube, of course. The front bushing bolt can now be installed. Since I installed the steering rack, I should bolt up the steering linkage. I treated this bolt with red Loctite thread locker. At the rear of the car, we still have to install the axle carrier before we can do the control arms. There is a pair of rubber bushings at either end of the axle carrier. These bushings have to be pressed into the axle carrier before the last big bolt can be screwed in. Any paint or rust left in the bushing hole will make the job harder, so it's important to clean it out. I don't own a press, so I installed the bushings a harder way. I positioned the two halves of the bushing on the axle carrier and slipped a bolt through both of them to keep them aligned. I found an old bearing race that was the same diameter as the metal lip on the rubber bushing. Using my grandpa's ball-peen hammer, I tapped the bushing into place. The lower bushing half is now installed. I removed the temporary bolt, flipped over the axle carrier, and repeated the process on the upper bushing half. Here I'm using silicone spray to lubricate the parts. The axle carrier is ready to be reinstalled. Earlier in this video, I temporarily mounted the rear of the frame with these two M10 bolts. As you can see from this diagram, each M10 bolt is supposed to pass through a cover panel first. My cover panels were rusted beyond repair. This is the right-hand side cover panel, which broke into two pieces. Off camera, I propped the rear end of the frame with a 2x4 so that I could remove the M10 bolts just long enough to position the new cover panels. With these parts loosely in place, I was able to mount the axle carrier. Next, I screwed in the M12 bolts, highlighted here in green. With the big bolts firmly in place, it's time for the M8 cover bolts and washers to be tightened. With the rear axle carrier installed, we can proceed with the rear control arms and final drive mounting bracket. Here are my refurbished parts queued up and waiting to go back on the car. I started with the final drive mounting bracket. This requires 3 M10x26 bolts to be installed using a long socket extension. With that bracket installed, the final drive mount can go on. This gets fastened with an M10x55 hex bolt and washer. Each control arm connects to the rear axle carrier at 2 points, plus the rear shock absorber. One of the 2 axle carrier bolts went in fine, but I had trouble with the second one. So I pivoted to the shock absorber bolt so that it would hold the control arm in place while I resolved the problematic bolt. I used the same strategy again on the second control arm. making good progress. Thanks for watching. More videos to come.